Depending on where you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Firstly, as we are GDPR compliant and to fulfill our obligations, we are letting you know that this webinar is being recorded. Thank you for attending the first of NSSG Talks, a monthly webinar series where we discuss relevant risk issues affecting industries across the globe. For today's discussion, we focus on the energy challenges in Central and Eastern Europe and assess whether a viable solution to these challenges comes from the Caspian Sea region. We have presenting for us today Alessandro Cipri, NSSG's Intelligence Manager, Joseph Hrabinha, Associate Intelligence Analyst, Robert Bellante, Senior Associate Intelligence Analyst, Eurasia. Right now, I'd like to begin with a little introduction about who we are and what we do, as some of you may not be familiar with us. NSSG is a specialist risk management company headquartered in Bucharest, Romania, with offices in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. We also have representation in Israel and in the UK. We provide an array of services to multinational clients, spanning across multiple industry verticals to high net worth individuals globally. From location-based threat vulnerability risk assessments to crisis response planning, from close protection, executive protection, to broader travel risk management services. From incident alerting via our C3I Global Security Operations Center to geopolitical risk forecasting. If you'd like to know more about who we are and what we do, please visit us at www.nssg.global. At this stage, I'll hand the mic to Alessandro, who will provide a brief overview of today's topic.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Joe. So basically, a Caspian solution to Europe's energy problem. You may be wondering why we chose this topic for our first webinar. And the reason why we chose this topic is because we believe that it really matters for all of the attendees. And this is regardless of the field of business or the position that they have within their company. And the reason why it matters is that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the price of energy and the utility bills have been soaring for companies and individuals alike. And as I mentioned, like this is something really horizontal that is really affecting the whole population of Europe, businesses and individuals alike. So there are hundreds of thousands of companies across Europe that are now at risk of being pushed out of business because of the price of electricity, and there are millions of households who are also sadly at risk of not having sufficient heating during the upcoming winter. These issues with the energy supplies have been also compounded by the recent announcement by Russia that the Nord Stream 1 pipeline would halt all of its operations until what they define as the collective West drops all of the sanctions against it, which, as you will guess, is very, very unlikely to happen. And basically, all of these developments matter for everyone, and they are likely to impact the business, the political, and the socioeconomic environment in Europe in the medium to long term. These developments basically happened just as the global economy was on the road to recovery from the supply chain shocks caused by the COVID-19 imposed lockdowns in the past 2 years. So basically, the current energy crisis drove the economy into what is defined as a stagflation, which is an economic phenomenon in which a situation in which the prices go up while also the economy falls into a recession. So basically, this is the issue that we are talking about today, and pretty much everyone in the public is very, very well aware of it. But what about the solution? Why the Caspian? Now, it's no mystery that the energy crisis that was born out of the current energy crisis was born out of over-reliance of the fossil fuels, namely oil and gas coming from Russia. Basically, the issue is that Europe did not sufficiently diversify its energy sources. And of course, in the media, there are many potential alternatives to Russia that are being discussed. For example, oil and gas from Algeria, Qatar, the United States, and also Egypt. However, there are very few mentions regarding the potential that the Caspian region will have to provide a solution to Europe's energy issues. Now, what is the problem with the Caspian? The main issue is that its location and the fact that historically the Caspian has been within the Russian sphere of influence, or within Russia, actually for the past 300 years. And basically many of the riverine states in Central Asia and the Caucasus only became independent from the Soviet Union after its dissolution in 1991. However, what is currently happening is a sort of a tectonic shift in the geopolitical alignment in the region, because several countries with a particular focus on Central Asian Republic have been increasingly keen on distancing themselves from Russia, which before was seen as a guarantor of stability, and now, for obvious reasons, that's not anymore the case. So what they're trying to do is to leverage their oil and gas resources that are in the Caspian Sea to provide a potential alternative to Russian oil and gas exports towards Europe. So now the question is, first of all, to what extent can the countries in the Central Asia and the Caucasus export sufficient oil and gas to Europe and provide at least a part of a solution to its energy problems? And then what sort of limitations there are to this, and also how is Russia going to react to this? So basically, this is what we are going to talk about during this webinar, and more specifically, Joseph will talk about the problem, part of the matter, and namely the impact that the energy crisis will have on the European economies and the social political stability within Europe, while Robert will instead focus on the solution part of the webinar, which is the focusing on the geopolitics of the Caspian, and explain the extent to which this geopolitics allows or constrains a potential solution to Europe's energy problems. So, Joseph, if maybe you want to start with explaining the problem.
Yes, thank you, Alessandro. So my name is Joseph Rabina, and I will today discuss the problems in Central and Eastern Europe that is actually heavily reliant on energy supplies from Russia, and it's kind of case in point for the entire problem. So I will break down today's presentation, or my part of the presentation will be broken down to description of the Central and Eastern Europe as a geopolitical and economic region. Then we will discuss the negative trends and energy crisis. And finally, we will discuss the threats to your business, or pretty much the socio-political, economic, and geopolitical risks that are coming with the problems we have in the Central and Eastern Europe. So firstly, I'll describe the regional economy. Central and Eastern Europe is European Union's industrial powerhouse, because majority of heavy industry is located in these countries. As you can see on the map, it is a part of Europe stretching from the Germany to European part of Russia, and from Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. And it has a rich tradition in heavy industry that consumes a lot of energy. Large share of the industry holds the automotive, and the biggest trade partner for Central and Eastern European countries is Germany. That actually re-exports the automotive production from these countries, and then France and Italy. Therefore, the Central and Eastern European economies, including Germany, are volatile to supply chain disruptions, which is, for instance, semiconductors case, when we see shortages in semiconductors from China due to the zero COVID policy in China and lockdowns of big ports. And the second biggest issue is the prices of primary commodities such as energies, metals, or food. As for geopolitics, most important actors in the region is Germany as economic actor, as the economic leader of the region. Poland as a rising military power with its latest purchases of military. It aspires to become the strongest land force in Europe. Then there is the United States as a leading NATO state, which NATO as an alliance is the hegemonic force in the Europe. Then we have Turkey that aspires to become a power broker in the Black Sea region. And last but not least, Russia is a challenger to the status quo and primary cause of geopolitical disruptions in the Eastern Europe. We'll move to economic disruptions now. Economically, we're looking at two major disruptions that are resulting in a record high inflation rates. Currently, we are talking about 15.6% in Central and Eastern Europe. In European Union, we're talking about average 9% as we speak now. And these inflation rates are also striking or resulting in industry disruptions. And if we break this down into two major phenomena that are contributing to this record high inflation rates, we're looking at the lack of supply. So we're looking at lack of spare parts to heavy machinery, so you can really fix your machines. We're looking at the lack of components to production, which is driving the prices up because there is a high demand and low supply, and therefore this results in a high inflation rate. And then we have second part of or second component of the inflation, and it's a prices-driven inflation that is a result of energy prices hikes, commodities prices hikes, etc. Why does it matter to your business? Firstly, the difference between the two is that the lack of supply-driven inflation is a long-term phenomena, because you cannot really fix it via some short-term market intervention or something similar to it. You really need to meet the demand, and it takes some time, and therefore inflation is here to stay. Contrary to the some claims that it's just a prices-driven inflation and it can calm down over the short period or in the short term. And also these predictions are wrong because we don't know when the war in Ukraine will end and whether Russia won't continue to wage economic war on the West even after the ceasefire in Ukraine, because public discussion is very, deformed by the fact that the sanctions are hurting our economy. But it's not only sanctions; it's also Russian speculations on the energy markets that are driving prices of gas up. Every time Russia does something to the Nord Stream pipeline, the prices are immediately skyrocketing. We can track this practice even half a year before invasion. At this time of previous year, we've been already talking about high prices of gas, and it was because of Russia was speculating in the markets. Secondly, and the second big issue for you as a business, especially business that, for instance, does manufacturing, or if you are planning to set up a business in the Central and Eastern Europe, you should consider that the prices will increase gradually, and there is a lack of spare parts across the region. Therefore, if you don't have a secure supply chain, or you don't have enough spare parts at your disposal, or some sort of primary commodities that you need in your production process, it will be very challenging. But also there's an opportunity for those who have secure supply chains. Since we cannot really fix the lack of supply, but we cannot really look into the solutions in the energy prices crisis. We'll look into alternative solutions to the energy prices crisis in the Central and Eastern Europe. Please, next slide, Joe. Thank you. So what are we looking at now? We can see that from the graphics on the screen, we can see that the Central and Eastern Europe is much less dependent on Russian oil than on the gas. Firstly, it's because oil is easier to transport, and you know, it's more market-driven market-driven business with oil than with the gas. Secondly, you know, since the best way how to transport gas is via pipeline, and majority of the Central and Eastern European countries are post-Soviet countries, so the pipeline infrastructure was already existing after the Soviet Union collapsed. Majority of these countries are really, you know, really chose to stick with the cheap Russian supplies that actually influenced their, you know, competitiveness of their exports, because the price is one of the primary determinants of your export or your product's competitiveness on the international markets. So the cheaper the better, right? I don't have to explain you to us businesses. So I'll just move to gas. As you can see on the graphics, 15 Central and Eastern European countries, together with Austria and Germany, imported 193 billion cubic meters of natural gas in 2019. So this number is very important. Also, just import of the CE countries without Germany and Austria, because if we have a look at the alternative solutions, we'll find out that there is not enough spare LNG on the international market that would cover at least half of these imports, right? This is the first and foremost thing. Second, there is a lack of existing infrastructure to import LNG. So there are too few terminals, even though some are in construction. But we're talking about the short-term fix. We need short-term fix, and the solutions are only mid to long term, because all these projects, either pipeline building, terminals building, or finding long-term partners or long-term suppliers. These things take time, and mostly we're talking about mid to long-term solutions. Also, there's a Caspian region, which will be more thoroughly tackled by Robert. I'll just outline a few basic numbers about imports of gas from Caspian. Current pipeline infrastructure from Azerbaijan that could supply Central and Eastern Europe has capacity only approximately around 20 billion cubic meters, and currently it supplies like 16.5 billion cubic meters of gas a year, which is too little if you look at the numbers on the screen. And Azeri production is also approximately 21 billion cubic meters per year, and we are again talking about increase in production, increase of pipeline capacity that would take mid to long term projects. So where does that leave us? Joe, please, next. Can we go to the next slide? Yes, it leaves us in a short, at least a short-term, severe economic crisis, or we're looking at the severe economic crisis in the short term that will reflect in social, political, economic, obviously, and geopolitical risks. And so we prepared the threats pentagon in the Central and Eastern Europe. As you can see on the screen, we rated risks from 1 to 30. As you can see, there is no such there is no low risk in all 5 cases, and we already witnessing increased costs of operations. due to the inflation, rental costs for businesses, manufacturing costs went up. For instance, in Germany, production costs went up 40%. In other Central and Eastern European countries, costs for energies went up at least by 20%, and we are not looking at the new period. So these bills will go substantially up as of January 1st. So if you're doing business there, you should be ready, or if you're planning to establish your business, you should be ready for increased cost of operations. That will reflect in everything. We also might be looking at the problem of salaries. People will demand higher salaries to cope with the inflation. So this is again another component and increased cost of operation. We'll move to the next risk, which is business disruptions and waves of bankruptcies. This is actually the part where we are at now. In Central and Eastern Europe, we see heavy industries closing down, such as fertilizers production. In Poland, in Slovakia, we've seen aluminium industry that was shutting down very recently. Much more is at stake for glass industry that is entirely dependent on gas supplies. And there is also issue with chemistry that needs chemistry industry that actually needs gas as a chemical component to its production. So we'll be looking at ways of first disruptions. So some larger companies will allow themselves to just pause their production. But smaller companies such as bakeries and small enterprises will likely face the existential issues, and they're already facing existential issues. With the wave of these business disruptions, we'll see wave of unemployment, which is the next slide. Wave of unemployment will definitely reflect in a public mood. We already witnessed large protests in Czech Republic that were showing dissatisfaction with the very recently elected Czech government, but that is pro-EU and pro-Western government. Slovakia is in a governmental crisis. We've seen very recently shift in Bulgarian government. We already are looking at issues in Poland. So I think with the approaching winter and with worsening economic situation, we might be looking at waves of civil unrests that will likely spill over to governmental issues and to disruptions on a governmental and political level. So we might be looking at the series of early elections in a short term, so 1 to 3 years. And finally, the final risk is a geopolitical one, and that is that if the governments won't be able to really reflect on the actual issues of people, people might turn to the new wave of anti-system populism in a form of I don't know. The role model could be Hungarian Viktor Orban. So also this anti-system populism will be likely aiming at or will be highly critical to the European Union. That might reflect in changes on the EU level or disruptions on the EU level, which we've seen similar to the ones we saw in 2016 after the Brexit vote in the UK, and after Donald Trump's election. So now I will move to short-term forecast. So we've got two different scenarios of development, or two dependent variables. So first is whether the Russian gas supplies are halted, or whether these, and the second dependent variable is whether the Russian gas supplies will resume. But regardless of the two outlined scenarios in the energy crisis, there are all the other two influences, independent variables, that will continue to disrupt economic and political dynamics in the Central and Eastern European region. So the first is that the world is still dealing with the supply chains disruptions caused by zero COVID policy in China, and there are still no plans to lift it in China. And we're headed into a flu season very soon, so we might expect disruptions in the supply chains and severe droughts that are influencing river transportation, that is reflecting on supply chain disruptions again intra-regionally. So you cannot transport goods from Romania to Germany through the river system, because there are low water levels. And also we are also looking at the problems in agriculture and fruit production that will likely protract for next 1 to 3 years. So having this in mind, in the short term, so in a period from 1 to 3 years, the Central and Eastern European region will likely face economic challenges regardless of the energy crisis solutions, because of the already outlined independent variables. The severity of social and political crisis will depend on the government's measures. The governments can take 3 different approaches. We're already actually witnessing something similar. So the governments will try to tax businesses and use money in welfare state measures, or compensate and subsidize citizens, and in order to protect them. Second, governments can try to tax citizens and use their money to subsidize businesses in order to protect jobs, or governments can take combination of both. So in the first scenario, we're looking at the prediction that if the gas supply from Russia is about to be halted, IMF predicts that the CE countries will be amongst the most damaged ones, along with Germany, as the EU as such would the GDP of the European Union would contract between 2 to 3%. Hungary, Slovakia, and Czech Republic are likely to face more than 5% GDP contractions, and all countries in the Central and Eastern European are predicted to contract in red numbers. Even Romania, that has very low dependency on Russian gas. Underlying case is the German economy, that already faces surges in industrial production costs. And for instance, if we take a look at the particular industries such as chemical industry, that employs almost 350,000 people. It's the third largest industry in Germany. It faces total disruption. So there are 350,000 jobs at stake when the Russian gas supplies are about to be halted. So and this also goes as a domino, because Germany is a primary export destination for the entire CE countries. If the Russian energies will continue flow to European Union, inflation will continue at the same rate, rate, the high energy prices and operation costs are already reflected in a wave of bankrupts, but countries and industries will look for ways to adapt. Most innovative companies will succeed, but until then, governments will need to subsidize the companies in order to secure their survival. Also, there's one important dynamic that we need to take care or take a look at. It's stability in relations with China, semiconductors from Taiwan, and electronics from China in particular, because these supplies from Asia Pacific are crucial to continuous flow of supply chains. That would be all from me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope Robert will deliver too. Thank you.
Many thanks, Joseph. Robert, if you want to jump in to talk about the solution side of the equation, please.
Of course. Thank you very much, Alessandro and Joseph, for your insights and for all that has been said before me. So I'm Robert Balante, Senior Associate for the Post-Soviet Space and the Eurasian region. My presentation will be structured as follows. So at the beginning, I will give a quick introduction with a few definitions and explanation why are we talking about the Caspian. Then we will look specifically at the region with its energy endowment, and this will make clear immediately why we're talking about it. Then obviously we will address the risks which are linked to the extraction and transportation of energy from the region. We will go through possible future scenarios, and then I will give a few practical advice and outline some implications for businesses in a variety of industries. Okay, so actually, before getting into the specifics of the Caspian, I believe it is necessary to reach a common understanding about what is energy security, actually. In fact, there are two possible definitions. The classic one, by which energy security means availability of sufficient supplies, affordable prices, and an alternative one, which means the elimination or reduction of threats for the energy factor to become a potential barrier to economic development in the mid to long term. Actually, in my view, for the purposes of this presentation, we should adapt the alternative definition, as the current crisis does not stem from an increase in prices by suppliers, but it stems from Europe's decision not to buy energy from Russia, which in turn has led to an increase in prices. Nevertheless, for both definitions, the first principle of energy security stands, and that is diversification of supply. And this is what we're going to look at in my part of the presentation. So why is it that we talk about the Caspian? Over the past months, in specialist circles, the Caspian region has come back to widespread attention. In fact, the pipelines that supply Europe, besides the energy stream that you all know comes from Russia to Germany through the Baltic, but the other pipelines actually run through Ukraine, and I believe it is obvious why they are in danger. But also, if you've opened the news recently, you're aware of the fact that Russia has occupied the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine, and this has highlighted the risks of over-relying on any given single source of energy. In this case, we're talking about nuclear. Thus, diversification, both in terms of energy and in terms of geography and energy type, is crucial. And also, you can see that a variety of industries tend to be impacted by the energy shortages, as clarified by Joseph, but they're also quickly listed in the last bullet of this slide. Now, if we look at the Caspian region specifically, the opportunities come clear. So on the next slide, we see that a British Petroleum study, which was carried out in 2018, has shown that currently the Caspian Basin delivers approximately 3.4% of total world oil supplies and almost 6% of total natural gas supply. I mean, I will admit that this is not the energy richest region in the world, but due to the current geopolitical realities, it is very important to talk about it as an alternative to Russia. Kazakhstan specifically holds the world's 12 oil reserves, while Turkmenistan holds the world's 6th largest gas reserves. And it is important to point out that for both of these countries, hydrocarbon trade accounts for approximately 25% of their national GDP. So what does this mean? On one hand, it means that they are highly dependent on this trade, but on the other, this means that they will try their best to maintain production and delivery stable. Kazakhstan is oriented towards Europe in its supplies, while Turkmenistan is actually oriented towards China, because China has a so-called no strings attached investment policy, which means that it doesn't care about domestic politics, about human rights, and it is more than happy to invest, in this case, in Turkmenistan, while the EU is not so keen on investment in this country. Special case, in my view, is actually Azerbaijan, because it lies closer to Europe, let's say on the European side of the Caspian Sea, and it holds the 20th and 25th reserves globally in terms of oil and gas. And even though these reserves are not huge compared to other states, it has various advantages. The first one is that 1 trillion cubic meters of gas are concentrated in a single gas field, the Shah Deniz field, which is already very well connected to Europe through gas pipelines. And the second advantage for this country, which is both a producer and a necessary transit country, it is that it is actually located, as I said, on the European side of the Caspian, and there is no need to transport energy from the Central Asian side of the basin. And in fact, it is not a coincidence that in July, Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, has actually traveled in person to Baku, to Azerbaijan, to meet with Aliyev, the country's president, and secured a memorandum of understanding to actually increase supplies to Europe. So now we can look at the risks on the following slide, and we will immediately start by explaining the difference between oil and gas in terms of supplies. So as Joseph has actually already said in the previous part, oil is much easier to sell, primarily for two reasons. First, the prices are globalized. They are the same all over the world. And the second one is that it can be transported in a variety of ways. It can be transported to pipeline, through rail, to ship, through trucks. While for gas, the situation is quite more complex. And the problem actually is in its name, that gas is a gas. This means that costs are approximately 5 times higher for its transportation due to its lower energy density. And it can be only transported in 2 ways, through pipelines or in the form of liquefied natural gas in huge refrigerator ships. For Central Asia, the only viable option is actually a pipeline, unless there is drastic progress in LNG technology, which would allow to transport it not only with these huge refrigerator ships. In fact, gas could actually be liquefied in Turkmen and Kazakh ports, transported to Azerbaijan, deliquefied, and then sent to Europe through pipelines. However, this kind of defeats the point of de-risking the supply, because eventually gas would still be delivered through pipelines, and a delivery across the Caspian via LNG would only increase risk. Then now we will look at the largest region-specific risk, and that is the legal status of the Caspian Sea. So as you noticed, I'm referring to this basin as a sea. However, this is more of a, let's say, people's way of calling it, because up to 2018, there was no clarity under international law on how to consider it a sea or a lake. And this is important because in international law, seas and lakes are treated differently in terms of who has the right to exploit mineral resources that lie under the water. So in 2018, a convention was indeed signed, and the 5 littoral states agreed that the Caspian was neither a sea nor a lake, but it was granted special legal status. So while on the surface, this solved the legal issue, in reality, it has not. In fact, not only Iran has never ratified this convention because there was a change in the leadership and the moods from a domestic point have changed, but also the document only settled the issue of who owns which part of the Caspian up to 45 kilometers from the coastline. But any question related to mineral rights beyond this point were supposed to be worked out on a bilateral basis. So taking the example of Azerbaijan, actually the country has indeed signed bilateral agreements with Russia and Kazakhstan on who can exploit which resources beyond these 45 kilometers lines, but it has not signed any agreement with Turkmenistan and Iran, which de facto render this convention invalid from an international point of view. Then there is the issue of the employment of non-locals. It has to be understood that in the region, there is actually a lack of skilled workers to be employed in the oil and gas industry, which leads to the need of importing them. And this largely takes place from Gulf states, which do have a much more skilled workforce. However, this has led in the past in Central Asia, honestly, primarily and specifically in Kazakhstan, to protests which have erupted on a nationalistic platform. In fact, locals often perceive that their governments are not sharing fairly the profits extracted from their soil, from the soil of the people who live in the region, and this has led to multiple protests and has disrupted for weeks production in the region. Another problem to look at is the lack of integration among Central Asian states. In fact, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, from a purely economic perspective, it made sense for the Central Asian states to increase their cooperation and to build further infrastructure linking them. However, ever since 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a drive to establish a national identity in each of the Central Asian Republic, and thus countries prefer to emphasize their differences rather than cooperate. So to give you a specific example, as recently as 2 months ago, in July 2022, there was a meeting of the 5 Central Asian states. And after the meeting, Turkmenistan and Tajikistan refused to sign a new friendship and cooperation treaty, and they did not even take part in the photo shoot at the end of this session. And this has once again underlined the divisions that there are among the Central Asian states. Then there is the China risk, and on this risk, I believe an entire separate webinar could be held. So I'm just gonna address it very, very briefly. So by 2016, China actually controlled directly or indirectly approximately 20% of Kazakh oil production. And as I mentioned, for the case of Turkmenistan, when Western companies want to invest in the region, they always have political strings attached to their treaties, while China doesn't do this, and it allowed them to build a much closer relationship with the local elite. Thus, the China factor should not be underestimated, but if you're interested in this, we can also discuss it in the Q&A session more broadly. Now, we can move to the second slide, and I will address the next slide, and we can address the transportation risk through the Caucasus and Turkey. So on the map, you see the pipelines that are currently in place, both gas and oil and gas pipelines. And something has to be understood about pipelines. First of all, they have very high fixed capital costs, which are linked to the construction of the pipe itself, the terminals, the acquisitions of the right of way, while relatively speaking, they have a low variable cost in terms of pumping and maintenance. So where does this leave us? Once the pipeline is in place, its operations have started, there are very large unilateral incentives for host countries to increase transit fees. So far, this has not happened in the region, but it could very well materialize in the future. Why am I saying this? Because up to 6 months ago, this region was competing with Russia as a transit region. But now, since Russia is not a viable option anymore, incentives are much higher for the Caucasian countries and Turkey to increase fees for the transportation of their resources to Europe, as there are no alternatives coming from this part of the world, from the east. Of course, and I'll go briefly through an array of other risks that are present in the region in terms of transportation. The first one, as you all know, is that Russia and Georgia fought a war in 2008. And on the map, you can see in dark yellow a region, which is South Ossetia, which is under de facto Russian control. And the pipelines that pass just to its south are only 42 kilometers away from this region, from the South Ossetian region, which means that in case of escalation, Russia could very easily disrupt supplies. Then there is the interstate conflict in between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which renders an alternative route very much impossible for energy to flow, and Azerbaijan and Georgia are the only viable options. And last but not least are all the problems that are linked to Turkey specifically. You might have read that inflation in Turkey has reached 80%, which is the highest level since 1998, which of course could lead to a variety of domestic problems, but also the pipelines run through the east of the country, which is a Kurdish populated area. And I'm sure you're all aware of the domestic problems which often take place in Turkey due to the Kurdish protests and fighting. So now we can look at the following slide, and unfortunately, I will admit that it is impossible to foresee the future, but there are a variety of scenarios that can be laid out, and we can look at them for how the war in Ukraine may play out and how it will impact EU's energy security. So on the next slide, we see scenarios. So the scenarios are listed in decreasing in a decreasing likelihood for them to happen. So scenario 1, in my view, in our view, is the most likely to materialize, and scenario 4 is the less likely. So the most likely scenario is for a low intensity war to continue for the foreseeable future with a de facto stalemate, but no official document signed. So no official peace treaty, and therefore no internationally recognized agreement on who controls which portions of the territory. And under these circumstances, actually, some business relationships could be restored and reestablished with Russia. For example, certain brands could return to the Russian market, be it digital services or clothing brands, for example. However, energy relations are unlikely to be reestablished because European energy giants very often have intimate relationships with their governments, and the European Western governments will likely attempt to maintain a high pressure on Moscow. The second scenario is for the war to end within 1 year with a formal ceasefire, with a formal document. However, it is very important to look at how it ends. On one hand, Russia might win, and by winning, I mean for Russia to impose its will on a considerable portion of the Ukrainian territory, let's say comparable to it currently controls approximately 20% of the whole of Ukraine. So in this case, relations with the West would deteriorate even further, most likely. And it is possible that Russian energy would stop flowing to Europe entirely. The energy crisis would thus become even more severe and protracted, leading to street protests in many countries. And we have already seen the first signs of it over the past week. And this could endanger commercial operations, both from a business continuity perspective, but also from physical risks to the assets of your companies. The second, let's say the version 2 of the second scenario is the case of a Ukrainian victory. And the Ukrainian victory is defined as retaking all of the territories that Russia has occupied since the latest invasion in February, on February 24th. In this case, actually, the struggle for power is very well possible to play out in Russia, considering that Putin has invested a very large amount of resources into this war, from a domestic point of view, most importantly in propaganda terms. And this would this highlights the risks that both regular citizens and local elites could not come to terms with such reality. In this case, there will be no fast return to business as usual, as Russia would need to figure out its domestic problems, and the West is also likely to attempt and maintain high pressure, and by West in this specific case, I mean the US primarily, is likely to maintain high pressure on Russia to favor a pro-Western outcome of this domestic struggle. The third scenario is a transition of power in Russia, and this means in a way or another, Putin is no longer in power. It might be the elites who put him aside. It might be an assassination that is carried out. It could be street protests. And in this case, uncertainty would be extremely high, because depending on how this stepping aside or ousting from power from Putin by Putin occurs, will lead to different outcomes. Both a more nationalistic or a more pro-Western government could actually be take power, but it is extremely hard to predict how it would play out. The fourth scenario, which is the least likely in my view, is for populist parties to come in power in some European countries. In Italy, for example, elections are scheduled for the 25th of September, and Mr. Salvini, whom some of you might know, is currently polling third, and he has called openly for an Italian stepping aside from sanctions, as he put it, it would not hurt Ukraine, but it would help Italy lower the energy price. If populist governments come to power, be it in Italy, Germany, France, or Czech Republic, which saw a very, very large manifestation of protest of around 70,000 people last week, any of these populist governments would attempt to put pressure on Brussels to change its stance on sanctions. And for example, if a single country restarts purchasing energy from Russia, even though this is very, very unlikely, the lower energy of prices in that country would lead to other countries clearly seeing the benefits of restarting supplies from Russia. Now, on the last slide, we were looking at some implication. So under all of these scenarios, probably except the last one, there would be a high sustained level of energy prices in the foreseeable future, with a very likely return to coal consumption in the short term, which is already in place. And this goes against all of the energy targets set by the UN and the EU. Thus, what Europe needs to do is to diversify. And as I said in the introduction, both in terms of type of energy, but also geography. So coal, nuclear, oil and gas, renewables should be looked at, and a variety of regions should be considered. Clearly, the Caspian, but also, as Alessandro was mentioning in introduction, other countries have to be looked at: Algeria, Qatar, Norway, the US, Egypt. And This is, as was said also, is the first principle of energy security. So how? In terms of in terms of businesses, how can your business prepare? So there are four actionable insights that we would like to share. The first and most basic one is to decrease energy consumption and improve the energy efficiency of your offices. Then, if you are, for example, an energy intensive business linked to manufacturing of goods, the advice is to build or increase reservoirs of energy to hedge against possible shock supplies. Then it would make sense to invest in renewables, as in this case, it would also act as diversification. You would not be dependent on any given nation state, but of course there is always a trade-off. You would be likely dependent on the climate, on what's outside. And last but not least, even though this is a more long-term solution, is to work with Central Asian states to decrease the risk of disruption happening on the ground if the Caspian solution to this crisis is actually implemented. Thank you, and back to you, Alessandro.
Thank you very much, Robert. At this point, I think is the moment for questions. I don't know if anyone in the audience has any particular question at this moment. It looks like there are none as of now. So I will start posing one question to Joseph. So building up on the scenario that Robert mentioned regarding the rise to power of a populist party within the European Union, I was wondering if that were to happen, what would be like the most likely scenario? Would this country like just drop the sanctions, or would they lobby the European Union to do so? If you can maybe expand on this, Joseph.
Thank you, Alessandro. First, the major issue is gas that is not sanctioned yet. So there's a different angle to this, and it's a Russian countermeasures, right? So once the populist party comes to power, such as the one in Bulgaria that is happening actually, and it's a great case for what would happen if a government that has more moderate stance to Russia comes to power. They will restart just talks about bilateral contracts, because as we know, majority of the post-Soviet countries were dealing with Russia on the bilateral contract basis, which guarantees much lower price for the beneficiary than the spot prices, right? The market prices. This is actually the major issue, because there was not lack of supply prior to war, but there was a panic in the market, and this panic in the market just resulted in high prices of energies. What would happen on the EU level? I think that these countries would end up isolated on the EU level, such as Hungary at this point. And we would see certain rifts across the European Union, because even you can see the rifts on the level of the Central and Eastern European Union, Central and Eastern European countries, and the Western countries that are more, pro sanctions, and there are more pro green policies, etc., etc. And this includes also Poland, that is on the forefront of anti-Russian policies. So even amongst the Central and Eastern European countries, there would be a rift between Poland and Baltic states that are strongly against purchasing more resources from Russia. And then we would have countries led by Hungary, Bulgaria, and other countries that will perhaps engage with Russia and try to renegotiate the contracts of long-term bilateral contracts. So I think the most likely scenario is that these countries will remain isolated. On the Commission level, there is only one body that is decisive, so they won't have any chance to influence it, and we would see. And in a midterm, I can predict what that would happen. What would happen if if there's more populist movements in the Europe, and how would they ally with each other? We've seen that Le Pen, Salvini, Orban, they all were allying, but at some point, but it didn't lead to anything, because usually populists cannot really deliver on their promises, because these promises are just driven by very simple narratives that are promising to people something that is actually not of a structural nature, so they cannot really build something. So they usually cease to exist in a short period of time, or they cease to go into backsides on the sideline. Yeah, so that would be all. Thank
you very much, Joseph. Then for Robert, I have another question. So basically, on Monday, the Chinese Foreign Ministry announced that Chinese President Xi Jinping on the 14th will be visiting Kazakhstan on his first trip since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this will be for bilateral talk with the President Tokayev. I was wondering if you think that this may have any impact on energy security, and if you could maybe analyze a bit this situation for us.
Yes, of course. So as I was mentioning, China has a very peculiar presence in the Central Asian region, and we can take it slightly more broadly to address the energy issue. So basically, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the two main actors in the region have always been Russia and the US. Russia for clear historical linkages, and it's important to mention that, for example, all of the elites in the region up to this day continue to speak Russian as their first language, and this brings the two very much close together. The US has been present as the only superpower after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it is important also to note that while the war in Afghanistan was ongoing, the US was trying very, very hard to secure a presence in the region to, in turn, secure its interests in Afghanistan. China actually has been under the radar for a very long time, and it is only since the late 90s that it has started to build relationships with Central Asian states. As I mentioned during the presentation, by 2016, it managed to control approximately 20% of the Kazakh oil supplies, while when it comes to Turkmenistan, also it has been mentioned during the presentation, it buys more than 50% of all Turkmen gas export, which means it has very high leverage on those countries. Ever since the pullout of the US from Afghanistan, Russia and China have become the two dominant players in the region. But it is very hard to predict how this will impact European energy security, because in the past, while Russia and the US were the two main actors in the region, Central Asian states actually adopted an approach of pitting the two against each other and increasing stakes. What I mean by this is that they would negotiate with both, raise stakes until one of the two would not follow through anymore, and go with the offer of the other. However, now it is Russia and China that are the two most active players, and between the two, they have a much better relationship, which means they can agree preventively before going into negotiations with Central Asian states on a division of benefit, And Europe, in this sense, would be left behind. In fact, Europe has never had a significant presence in the region, and it has only now starting to build it, and it is focusing even more on the Caucasus rather than Central Asia, because also as it has been outlined, there are no direct possible supply lines from Central Asia to Europe which avoid Russia or pass through the Caspian. So having said this, Xi Jinping would for sure address the energy issues in his meetings with Tokayev, and Europe unfortunately has not much to say in these terms.
Okay, many thanks for your answer, Robert. We have the last question for Joseph that I would like Joseph to address, which is basically about European energy security. So basically, how fast can Europe secure alternative energy sources, for example, from Qatar, Algeria, other countries? If you can maybe expand on this.
Thank you for your question. It is a good question. I think firstly, we're looking at mid to long-term solutions in this. That's the first thing we need to stress out, and we need short-term solution because we're heading to a very difficult winter with Russia having finger on the trigger that can just shut down the industry in the entire European Union. That would be disastrous for us. So in a midterm, I don't think looking for alternative solutions or alternative gas supplies is a viable option. I think the best option is to diversify the energy portfolio as such. So look at the renewables, nuclear, geothermal, etc., and add gas on the level that is really necessary for just sustaining our economy with competitive prices, etc., on international markets. There's a big issue with LNG. LNG is usually bound in a long-term contracts. So Qatar would have to just cancel the contracts or withdraw the contracts, or we would have to buy these contracts out. And LNG is usually much more expensive option. So for instance, if we would manage to find alternative supplies via pipeline, and we would still be having these long-term contracts with Qatar, for instance, it wouldn't be viable for our economy on LNG, obviously. So maybe building, again, pipeline infrastructure from Algeria can be, but again, that's a midterm to long-term solution. And also, you need to look at this from the business perspective. Is there a return on investment in this? If we are trying to decarbonize, therefore, gas was only the mid step in a decarbonization. So there is no long-term return on investment for gas companies. So there is no there's no ROI on building big infrastructure projects or signing long-term contracts. So I think there's a big deal of debate on the EU level now, and I think mid to long term, in a short answer, is the best answer for it.
Okay, great. Thank you for that answer, Joseph. And I'd like to thank Robert and Alessandro for the kind of really interesting insights and overviews of this critical area of interest for not only the CEE, but it seems like there's a kind of broader kind of implications outside the region as well. So at this stage, I'd like to conclude the Q&A portion of this webinar. We hope you found the presenters and their answers helpful and insightful. This concludes our webinar, A Caspian Solution to Europe's Energy Challenges. If you have any additional questions, feedback, or would like to know more about NSSG, then please do not hesitate to contact us at servicedesk@nssg.global. From the team at NSSG, we thank you for attending the first of our NSSG Talk series and hope to see you at future events. Goodbye.